very exciting time for Seattle Pacific University. We are very excited to be able to present this lecture before you. But before we begin, we should definitely mention those who are worthy of thanks. We should first mention the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. They gave us a grant which allowed us to help bring in speakers that we've been enjoying. Also, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute has also helped to fund bringing in speakers. And we have a representative from ISI. Emily is in the far back. Raise a hand. You will definitely want to notice where she's sitting because ISI does a bunch of things. Their mission is to inspire college, or educate for liberty is their motto. And more relevant for you, they give students free stuff. So there's free stuff to be had, and Emily has the goodie bag. This includes books, so nerds galore, head in the back at the end and have at it. The last person I should mention is also a name that you should definitely all know. Dave Ritter is in the back. He's our cameraman. You should know that he's here after hours. He is that passionate and committed to his job. Thank you, Dave. All right, well, let's talk about our speaker today. We are extremely excited to have Professor Jim Huffman with us today. He's from Lewis and Clark Law School. He is the Dean Emeritus there and Professor of long standing. He was there before Lewis and Clark became known for environmental law. And he was one of the key individuals who helped in that transition. He's been fascinated by the correlation of the free market and environmental stewardship for a long time, and something he's been thinking about and has extensively written about, including over 100 articles. So he is extremely well known in the field, and we are extremely grateful to be able to welcome here to SPU.
Well, thanks, Caleb. It's a pleasure to be here. I would ordinarily conduct myself as I would in a law school classroom, which means I would call on you, and you would answer the questions, and then you'd ask me questions, and I wouldn't answer any of them. I would just ask you other questions, and that's known as the Socratic method, which not very many people are very good at, and I'm not sure I am, but we're not going to do that tonight because for a couple of reasons. I've made some prepared remarks, partly out of deference to those who've been asked to comment on what I have to say. I thought it better to give them a little advance opportunity to know what I've had to say, although my caveat was I might change it, and I did a little, but not too much. And also, I wanted to keep this in a time frame that was manageable, because you get me going on this topic and I can go on for a very long time. So I do have these prepared remarks, but I'm also very happy to go totally off script and answer any kinds of questions you may have or that may come up in the subsequent discussion. Well, I've been reading and thinking and teaching and writing and speaking about the relationship between markets and environmental stewardship for a long time, as Caleb mentions. Having spent virtually all of my academic career among colleagues who are overwhelmingly predisposed to believe that regulatory solutions are the best solutions to environmental and most other social issues, I've often felt as if my words have sunk without a trace. But whether due to my influence or the influence of many others, mostly I think others, there has been some significant change over the course of the last 3 or 4 decades. We now have tradable emissions permits, water marketing, fee hunting, and conservation land trusts. It hasn't been a free market revolution, but all save the most extreme environmental advocates have come to accept that markets are a powerful force indifferent to the objectives of competing market participants. Of course, the fact that markets are indifferent to outcomes and explains why many environmental advocates object to markets even where they have been demonstrably successful in delivering environmental benefits. Now, way back in the days, long before any of you, at least in the back several rows, were born, in the days of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring, 1962, Donella Meadows, who was the principal author of The Limits to Growth, 1972, and the recently departed Barry Commoner, who wrote The Closing Circle in 1971, one would have been considered a lunatic to suggest that markets might benefit the environment. And that's exactly what a guy named Julian Simon did in a book called The Ultimate Resource, which was published in 1981. And Simon was thought by all mainstream environmentalists to be a free market ideologue, or worse yet, to be in the pocket of industry. Now, you might recall, if you know any of this history, that a fellow by the name of Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb in 1969, made a wager with Simon on the trend in the prices of 5 basic metals: copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten. The wager was what would happen to the prices of those 5 metals over the decade from 1980 to 1990. Ehrlich bet the prices would rise, reflecting growing scarcity, while Simon bet they would fall, reflecting a growing supply and more efficient use. The prices of all 5 commodities declined, and Ehrlich mailed Simon a check for $576.07. They had some formula based on what the actual change in those prices were. Now, most environmental advocates would have bet with Ehrlich on that bet, but Ehrlich lost. At the same time that Simon was writing about the counterintuitive reality that prices of finite earthly resources can decline even while those resources are being consumed at increasing rates, a small cadre of entrepreneurial academics began formulating the ideas that would come to be called free market environmentalism. Terry Anderson, Rick Stroop, John Bodden, P.J. Hill, a colleague of Stevens at Wheaton, all at the time were at Montana State University, and they asked this question. They asked, if markets can produce high-quality bread and computers and cars, why can't they produce environmental quality? To answer that question, they formed something called the Political Economy Research Center, which is now called the Property and Environments Research Center. Thus, they didn't have to change their emblem. Was founded in 1980, and a decade later, Anderson and a fellow named Don Leal published a book called Free Market Environmentalism. That was in 1991, in which they offered early evidence of what markets can do for the environment. Now, at a 1991 conference at Lewis and Clark, to discuss Anderson's and Leal's book, I presented a paper which was titled Protecting the Environment from Orthodox Environmentalism. It was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. And after pointing out that mainstream environmentalists generally blamed environmental problems on free markets, I argued that markets can actually be used to advance environmental protection, and that many of the statist solutions that have been implemented over the preceding 3 decades were actually doing environmental harm. They were doing harm by providing ever more opportunities for special interests to seek advantages through the political process. The more government got into the resource allocation business through command and control regulation and public resource management driven by robust public participation, the more environmental protection became a paradise for what economists call rent seekers. Those political interest groups who seek legislation and regulations that will benefit them at the expense of the less politically influential. Well, now I've made 2 what I suspect for many of you are counterintuitive claims. First, that markets through which individuals and businesses seek to maximize their individual welfare can promote a widely shared interest in environmental protection. And second, that pursuit of environmental protection through public process and government regulation and management can sometimes result in private gain at the expense of the environment. So having thus turned the orthodox world upside down, I will undertake to try to persuade you that my claims have validity and that we therefore need to be ever more flexible and open-minded in our thinking about environmental protection. Now, water is at the center of many environmental protection challenges because its physical use has long been allocated through private property regimes, and because economists have for at least half a century focused on water markets as a solution to many environmental to water allocation disputes, water provides a good context for exploring these two counterintuitive claims that I've made. Now, markets are said to be desirable because, assuming complete information and zero transaction costs, they result in the efficient allocation of scarce resources. An allocation is more efficient than another if it results in more net benefits to society, where costs and benefits are assessed by the parties to each transaction. In other words, there is no absolute or fixed measure of cost or benefit, but we know that both parties are better off because they have voluntarily agreed to whatever resource allocation results from the market exchange. If both parties are better off by their own assessment, we must conclude that society is better off unless we are prepared to explain why some individuals' preferences are objectively better than others, and to accept that some individuals' self-defined welfare can be legitimately sacrificed to the self-defined welfare of others. Now, economists will be quick to point out that because information is never complete and transaction costs always exist, there will be market exchanges that are not efficient. This is true, and under these circumstances, regulation or public management may result in greater efficiency than the market. Government's role in such cases of market failure is to internalize the costs and benefits experienced by individuals not party to the transaction, to replicate what the market would have produced had there been complete information and zero transaction costs. But as we shall see, and as is apparent, I think, to anybody who thinks very long about it, governments, too, always involve transaction costs and never have complete information. Not to mention that government, unlike private market participants, has legal authority to coerce conduct. Now, economists will also point out that some environmental benefits take the form of public goods that will not be provided privately due to high transaction costs, including the problem of controlling access by free riders, and that markets sometimes can be monopolized, thereby short-circuiting the price mechanism of supply and demand. Both of those circumstances also warrant government intervention in the interest of efficient resource allocation. So I'm not advocating markets as a solution to every problem society may face or every environmental problem. Although, in my experience, suggests that if you advocate for markets in any setting, you sort of become interpreted as one who advocates for them in all settings. It's part of our tendency to be, it's all this way or it's all that way. So I plead with you not to jump to that conclusion. Now, others, and including, I suppose, some economists, will object that what some individuals count as benefit offends standards of the community and thus does not contribute to net social welfare. And fair enough, every community has a set of widely shared values meant to influence and limit individual choices. But I would also suggest that most such violations of social norms, at least in the United States, will also constitute infringements on the legitimate private interests of others. That social norms, in other words, almost always exist to assure that every individual respects the autonomy and liberty of every other individual. Thus, when social norms are violated, it generally means that some individuals are forced against their legal rights to accept the results of choices made by others, meaning that the particular market transaction is not efficient. Some, including many environmentalists, will further object that the foregoing hypothesis, will object to the foregoing hypothesis and will argue that this whole efficiency thing is rooted in an objectionable philosophy of individualism. They will argue that this is a sort of anthropocentric thinking that got us into this environmental mess in the first place. We must think biocentrically, they will urge. We must take account of the interests of other creatures, of ecosystems, of the planet. But how do we do that? We are all, after all, humans. We have no way of knowing what is in the best interests of bears or butterflies or the greater Yellowstone ecosystem or of the planet Earth. The best we can do is, to use a terrible word, anthropomorphize these natural phenomena. Worse, the best any one of us can do is personalize the bear or the butterfly and claim that our values are superior to those others might choose to impose in the name of nature. Who gets to say what is in the best interests of the environment? Those who purport to speak for nature often look to nature for the answers, but nature's amoral and unforgiving ways offer little guidance in a quest for moral certainty. Well, I digress from that philosophical diversion and return to water as a way of illustrating some of these points. For 4 centuries in the eastern United States and well over a century in the West, water in America has been allocated through the institution of private property. In the East, owners of riparian land, which is to say land adjacent to waterways, possess a right to the reasonable use of water flowing over or past their lands. In the West, those who put water to beneficial uses acquire private rights to the water thus appropriated. It is a right of use, what lawyers call a usufruct, but contrary to the claims of many who would argue that water rights are somehow less secure from government regulation and taking than rights in land, a water right has all the attributes of any other property right. Possession may be 9/10 of the law, but use, including non-use in the form of preservation, is what gives any property value. Property interests in water are an essential attribute of a water market. Without property, and I would add contract, without assurances that I own what I claim and that an agreement to sell or lease obliges me to deliver what I have promised, there can be no markets. Markets are totally reliant on property rights and enforceable contracts. They are the fundamental legal infrastructure necessary to efficient resource allocation through markets. But property rights in water are not so easily defined and enforced as property rights in land. Water is constantly flowing, precipitating, evaporating, percolating. It cannot be fenced in or captured except temporarily. The laws of water rights reflect these physical realities. They also reflect the political influence of those who came first and sought advantages in whatever markets might develop, with the result that water markets often did not develop, or developed in a way that excluded some prospective uses and users from participation. Statutory specifications of acceptable uses, limits on transfer unrelated to protecting the rights of others, rules making water appurtenant to the land on which it was first put to use, and government regulations about the use of water stored or delivered from state and federal projects all prevented market transactions that would have led to more efficient allocation of water. When water prices vary between agricultural and urban users by as much as a factor of 100, we can be sure that water markets are not working very well, or more likely do not exist. Still today, some agricultural users in California can purchase water for as little as $8 or $10 an acre foot. Meanwhile, cities are paying $2,000 an acre foot to desalinate seawater. That situation could not survive if a market existed. Now, some of this may be market failure resulting from poor information and high transaction costs, but most of it is better understood, I think, as legal system failures. As Judge Posner observed way back in the 1970s, when even he was studying water markets, proving, if you know who Judge Posner is, you know that he's written a book on virtually every topic you can think of. But little did you know he'd also written about water markets. Posner said for efficient water markets to exist, or efficient markets of any kind to exist, they require property rights that have 3 characteristics: exclusive, transferable, and universal. In other words, water rights must recognize exclusive rights of use. They must be transferable to other uses and users, and all water must be owned. Now, the economists in the room could no doubt explain why those rules, why Posner would say those rules are essential, and we can return to that if you want to explore that later. Without these characteristics, market transactions will not result in efficient resource allocation in the sense that net benefits to society are maximized. The point is this: many of what have often been presumed to be market failures resulting from the elusive nature of the water resource are in fact legal system failures and can be remedied by making water rights exclusive, transferable, and universal. So returning to my counterintuitive propositions, how is it that water markets can promote environmental protection, and why does government regulation and management in the name of environmental protection sometimes result in private gain at the expense of the environment? Poll after poll indicates that most people favor environmental protection. In fact, it would be difficult to find anyone willing to say that they object to environmental protection, that they favor environmental harm for its own sake. Of course, those same polls would show that most people want a comfortable, safe, and healthy life for themselves and their friends and family. A comfortable life does not come without some effect on the environment. So choices must be made. What environmental costs are we willing to bear in exchange for how much comfort? How much fish habitat are we willing to sacrifice to electric power generation? How much water pollution is acceptable in return for abundance of irrigated crops? Or to put these questions differently, how much electric power and abundant crops are we willing to sacrifice to fish habitat and cleaner water? There are really only three different ways to make these choices as a society. We can declare that everything is a commons, that every person is free to use whatever water they can gain access to in whatever way they choose. We can recognize authority in some social process or institution to make the choices, or we can recognize rights in particular individuals to make the choices through the exercise and exchange of those rights. The first option generally leads to what Garrett Hardin famously labeled the tragedy of the commons. Every individual has an incentive to maximize personal use, but little incentive to conserve and protect the resource for the long term. As Nobel laureate Elinor Ostrom has pointed out, there are circumstances where commons have worked reasonably well, but they appear to be limited to small, homogeneous communities. The second option, that which I think is generally preferred by most environmental advocates, requires that individuals express through participation in some political process or other, not their personal preferences, but their opinions about what constitutes the public interest. Though I suspect we will find that their personal preferences and their views of the public interest somehow almost always correspond. These political processes can range from community meetings requiring consensus among all participants, citizens' initiatives requiring a majority vote, representative legislative bodies of many different types, or appointed experts who may or may not consider public input. A consensus model is really a commons, which, as noted above, only works on a small scale and often works because of strong peer pressures. The citizen initiative approach is way too cumbersome to make any but the most general of choices, and those of us who live in Oregon and Washington know well how the citizens initiative process works. That leaves us with the majoritarian legislative or appointed expert models as the only practical alternatives. Now, we could pretend that majority legislative decisions are by definition expressions of the public interest, or for our purposes, the optimal allocation of water resources between human comfort and environmental protection. Or we could acknowledge that they reflect the political influence of competing interests. While every interest that engages in the political competition will claim that its particular interests are the public's interests, the reality is that, like individual participants in a private market, participants in the political process seek to minimize their costs and maximize their benefits, usually in the form of legislative or regulatory preferences, or better yet, direct or indirect subsidies. Sometimes they win, sometimes they compromise, and sometimes they lose. Whatever the outcome, the only thing we know for sure is that any particular result reflects the politics of the moment, with any relationship to efficient resource use being entirely random. In the context of water, different interests have employed different strategies to gain advantage in these legislative exercises. As in a card game, one effective strategy is to have a trump card, a play that overrides the normal rules. In politics, the most effective trump is a rights claim. Individual rights are supposed to function as trumps. In fact, Ronald Dworkin wrote a book about rights called Taking Rights Seriously, in which that's exactly the way he described rights, as trumps. So individual rights are supposed to operate as trumps, although the United States Supreme Court has weakened rights claims through the use of various balancing tests and through varying standards of review that have the effect of establishing a hierarchy of rights with economic liberties, property and contract, at the bottom. Environmental advocates have long employed the Trump strategy, and we're not talking Donald Trump here, of course, by appealing to both moral arguments and rights claims, often integral to each other. Moral arguments elevate the normal public interest claim to higher ground. It's more effective to claim that a particular policy flows from a moral imperative than to argue merely that the society will be better off as a result of implementing that policy. Better yet, if a rights claim can be said to flow from the moral imperative, it becomes a trump on normal political competition. In water and water-related resources, public rights claims are asserted as having both constitutional and common law pedigrees. Several state constitutions assert state ownership of water. I believe that's true of the Washington Constitution. And others have more general references to public resources and the environment. It has been urged that these provisions should be interpreted to constrain legislative decisions and to override private claims of right in the use of water. Now, one complication in the interpretation of both constitutional and common law-based public rights claims is whether they have the effect of establishing a proprietary interest on the part of the state or a public interest that can be asserted by the state or by the general citizenry. State proprietary interests are the same as private proprietary interests in the sense that they can be bought and sold. State owns property, private parties own property. They transact with each other, buy and sell, lease. Non-proprietary public rights claims are often said to operate as limits on the state as well as on private actions that may conflict. It is these claims that pose the most difficulty for water markets because of uncertainties as to their nature and scope, and as to who has standing to assert them when conflicts arise, standing being the legal concept of who can actually go into court and assert a particular claim. For example, I couldn't go in to court and assert a claim that belongs to Professor Henry. Only he can assert his claim. And so we have that question as well as the uncertainties that come with these rights. Now, these common law-based rights claims arise principally from three doctrines: the public trust doctrine, the ancient use doctrine, and the law of public nuisance. All of these doctrines are asserted as limits on private rights and or as mandates for public action. The strategic strength of these claims lies in their effectively predating and thereby preempting claims of private right, and also preempting any takings claims that might be brought against the government under the Fifth Amendment or similar state constitutional guarantees of compensation. The weakness in these claims from the environmentalist perspective is their traditionally narrow scope, and therefore the need to rely on creative judicial interpretation if they are to have significant modern effect. By way of illustration, consider the public trust doctrine. It is often said that the doctrine derives from ancient Roman law, as evidenced in the following statement from Justinian, who was an emperor who pulled together Roman law and wrote it all down. Presumably he didn't do it personally. He had a few assistants. But this sentence is widely quoted. You won't have to look far. Google Justinian and you'll find it at the top of the list. Quote, "By the law of nature, these things are common to all mankind, the air, running water, the sea, and consequently the shores of the sea." Well, in fact, the public trust doctrine described by Blackstone many hundreds of years later and relied upon by early American courts was only a very distant cousin of the Roman law described by Justinian. And if you want me to ramble on endlessly on that subject, I'm happy to do so. Under early English law, the public had a right of access to the sea and inland waters affected by the tides for the purposes of fishing and commercial navigation. And a few courts included bathing as a public use of these waters and the seashore. When the doctrine was imported, or we often say received, in the colonies of this country and subsequently in the states of this country, along with the rest of the common law, it was modified only to account for the fact that many navigable waters on the North American continent are navigable well beyond the ebb and flow of the tides. So in England, this principle applied to all waters that were affected by the tides, which happened to be coincident, roughly, with all waters that were useful for commercial navigation, which has to do with the fact that there aren't many inland waterways on the British Isles that aren't affected by the tides. And of course, the Thames at London is affected by the tides and therefore was covered. But in the United States, of course, we had vast inland waterways that were navigable for commercial purposes and were not affected by the tides. So the doctrine was expanded to include that, but otherwise really operated unchanged until the latter half of the 20th century. Along the way, the United States Supreme Court concluded that the public trust doctrine precluded the legislature of the state of Illinois from granting the entire lakeshore of the city of Chicago to the Illinois Central Railroad. Although the court's clear meaning was that the state could grant some, but not all, of the Chicago waterfront to a private party, modern lawyers and courts have mistakenly concluded that the case means that the state can never alienate waters or lands affected with the public trust. Writing in 1964, Professor Joe Sachs, then at the University of Michigan, now at Berkeley, argued that environmentalists might find the public trust doctrine to be a powerful tool if they could overcome its historical shackles. He even used that term in the title to one of his articles. In other words, if environmentalists could persuade courts to extend the geographic reach of the traditional doctrine beyond navigable waters to waters affecting navigable waters, and even to resources having no connection to water, and if they could persuade courts to extend protected uses beyond navigation and fishing to recreation and other uses of public trust resources, they would be able to stop all manner of economic development. Now, courts in several states have agreed to these extensions of the historic doctrine, generally by claiming that the common law courts have always had authority to adapt the law to changing circumstances and public needs. In the state of Montana, for example, virtually every stream and river in the state is considered navigable and therefore public trust waters based upon the fact that it is available and has been used for recreation. Well, if you were attentive to what I described the doctrine as, nothing to do with recreation in its historical context, but the creative Montana Supreme Court has said recreation is included and therefore all kinds of waters not previously included are. On a related note, you may have read that a flurry of proceedings have been filed in all 50 states in the last several months, claiming that greenhouse gas emissions violate the public trust doctrine or constitute a public nuisance. And I suspect a judge or two will agree, not because there is any legal precedent that might put potential defendants on notice, but on the theory that it is the judge's job to update the law. Now, there's a lot I might say about why this understanding of the role of the courts is mistaken in a system based on the rule of law. But suffice to say that the prospect of such unpredictable change in the law creates an enormous obstacle to the functioning of water markets. Remember, for markets to work, we need property rights that are exclusive, transferable, and universal. And an exclusive right can only be exclusive if we know what its boundaries are, if we know what it is that it grants to the owner, and thereby limits others from intruding upon. So uncertainty that comes with sort of free-flowing judicial interpretation by the courts is very detrimental to the functioning of water markets or any other kinds of markets. So in conclusion, let me just say this. So there's been a slow but steady recognition of the positive role of markets in protecting natural resources and the environment. Water policy has, I fear, witnessed some counter trends over the past decade. Internationally, there has been a strong push for what is called integrated collaborative water management, or sometimes integrated collaborative river basin management, which are other words, I think, for central planning. And these are river basins that often cross national borders. There have also been persistent objections to reliance on privatized municipal water systems as a solution to the lack of potable water in much of the world and the resultant and tragic health consequences. Many writers have pointed out that if we really want to improve the environment to benefit human health, the most effective place to invest is in potable water supplies across the globe. And markets could get us there and have demonstrably done so in some places, but there's a very strong opposition to those on sort of principled moral grounds on an international basis. In the US, there's been a similar push for collaborative river basin management. We have it right down on the Klamath River in southern Oregon and northern California as the solution to water allocation controversies. All of this works against the establishment of water markets, as does the assertion and recognition of vague and ill-defined public rights. In light of the opportunities for manipulation of public processes and the difficulty of determining optimal allocations of water, maintenance and improvement of the system of water rights warrants more attention than it has generally received over the past few decades. It is commonplace to condemn private rights systems, particularly the Western appropriation system, as outmoded and in need of replacement with ever more public and political process. But the reality that public processes are, like markets, merely a way of aggregating individual preferences should lead us to judge the alternatives on the basis of what we can reasonably expect in terms of resource allocation outcomes. What we know about politics is that it rewards those with political influence. Politics tends to yield all or nothing solutions, either this or that. We also know that once taken, political decisions have significant inertia. They are hard to change. Historically, consumptive users of water in industry, mining and agriculture, had the upper hand. Today, it is environmentalists and anti-growth interests. Because markets allow for subtle, day-by-day reallocations of resources and reflect the choices of individuals with powerful incentives to acquire the relevant information, there is little doubt that the water resource would have been more efficiently allocated had we relied more on markets and less on government regulation and management. It is often said that water is special because it is essential to human survival as well as to a healthy environment. But if water really is special, we should be all the more interested in finding allocation mechanisms that lead to efficient use of the resource. If markets are allowed to play a central role in the allocation of our nation's and the world's water resources, it's my belief that the environment will be the better for it. Thank you.
Jen, hold on, I can tell everybody why you're up there.
Okay.
We should let you know that Jen is not only passionate about the environment, she was hiking in the environment yesterday and twisted her ankle, and so she's showing the kind of stalwart abilities that we expect to see of our academics. So, strength galore.
Thanks.
We should mention that Dr. Curry was a professor at Calvin College, where she was not only involved in a lot of obviously teaching and a very successful professor, also director of research. She's received 2 Fulbrights. She was heavily involved with Fulbrights, particularly in Hong Kong. And now she is currently the provost of Gordon College. So she is a very well-regarded academic and particularly has done research in this field. So I want to make sure everyone knows the reason.
So I'm going to comment on what's the presentation that you just heard. And what you're going to hear is more maybe an argument with myself, because I'm somebody who's totally sympathetic to all the arguments that have just been made, yet I always have certain hesitations that come up in terms of going down that road. And so what I'm going to do is share some of those, and part of those come from, as a geographer and having lived abroad, to see on the ground some of the impacts, and so the reality. So it's really looking at scale too, the theory and then the reality on the ground, and how do we come to terms with those. So we'll see if I can make some coherent comments here. First of all, I'm totally sympathetic with markets, and a lot of you heard that before, but I always become very hesitant to do what I call putting faith in markets. So it's almost like a religious move that some have, and I'm not claiming that the previous speaker had that, but an overemphasis of markets as the solution to all problems. I'm just always hesitant to that. And I'll just use a personal example that sort of gave me pause. Is when I was in New Zealand, you have to understand, in New Zealand, they've really gone down the road of free markets and a free market economy. And so I was talking to somebody, and they talked about the national parks, and they said, yeah, we want to price it at its value, right? So that everybody had to pay to go camping in the national park. And I started thinking about that, and there was something that bothered me about it, and it was because as an American, we have this idea that everybody ought to get to experience a national park. So can we always say that it should be a market value, or is there something about the community that we want to ensure that those that don't have the same resources can have some of those common experiences? So here are just some of those issues that always come to mind when it comes to the market. So one is the scale at which the impacts of the free market are experienced. So often you hear of efficiency at a global scale or even a national scale, or that people are better off when you aggregate at a national or a global scale, but it doesn't tell you what the impact is on the local. And often at the local level, there are negative impacts. And I encourage you all to just be really truthful about facing those negative impacts. It doesn't mean that you don't use the market, but you really have to deal with those as a reality and decide how to respond to those negative impacts, rather than to just say to people, well, sorry, it's the market, you're going to have to deal with that yourself. Move is what some people say. Well, if they don't have the money to move, they can't. So be realistic about that. Another hesitation I always have is that the market gives power to those who have resources. So when it comes to water, you have to actually have money to buy the resource if it were a total good that could be exchanged in the market. So there are always issues of power involved. And so I think that's another area as the markets operate that you have to address issues of power. And a lot of those issues of power come from whether a place has strong institutional and judicial structures or not. It can often not be a problem of the market, but the reality on the ground is Some countries do not have strong judicial systems. Some of them do not have strong democratic political processes. And so where the market plays out does not have an even playing field. And so you have to be very honest about that. And then another issue to me is treating humans as primarily consumers, because that's what the market does. And so you have to be well aware of the view of humans that the market assumes and not allow that to shape all relationships. Because as I spoke earlier today, this idea that we are beings that are made to be in relationship with others, not just through the market, but through many other ways as well. And there's a richness to our ability to be in relationships that cannot be brought down to just the level of market relationships. There's something more to it. So I would argue that there are always social choices on how we organize the rules around markets. And so it's not like they're neutral out there. Institutions shape those rules. And I just wanted to give you one example, and this comes from New Zealand, where they have created political systems that correspond to the watershed. And so they're called regional councils. So that would be the equivalent of states, are organized around watersheds. So it's a way of defining the political unit that corresponds to the watershed. And then they just say they don't have a lot of rules or command and control and all the rules within that watershed, but they do say that there can be no negative impacts of what people do within. So if you want to build a house or a development, you can do it whatever way you want, but there can be no negative environmental impacts. So it's a way of allowing the market to operate without lots of regulations, except that environmentally, there have to be certain standards that are met. So it's what do you call that? Freedom within the bounds. Freedom within defined bounds. So I think there are all kinds of creative ways to think about how we structure the rules within which markets operate that take into account those on-the-ground reality issues. So I think I'll stop there.
That was very, very good. Now Professor Preston is going to be telling us a bit as well. Those of you who have been at the afternoon session have already heard a bit of this introduction, but he is the Dean at Wheaton College's Business School and has written extensively on not only water rights, but also how businesses develop. So he's looking at it from several different perspectives.
Professor Huffman spoke about the problems of transfers of water rights and how those transfers impact water markets. And you mentioned transaction costs and then kind of moved on to legal system damage. But I wanted to maybe highlight a little bit about those transaction costs. Professor Huffman also mentioned the tragedy of the commons. I thought about the tragedy of the commons and I thought about transaction costs. It reminded me of the tragedy of the anti-commons. And then, as Professor Huffman mentioned, the tragedy of the commons occurs when there's just too many use rights and no rights of exclusion. Everybody can graze their sheep on the commons and the commons gets overused. The tragedy of the anti-commons occurs in an opposite situation. There are too many rights of exclusion. There's multiple veto rights. And the result is that the resource is underused. And so that the commons, anti-commons dichotomy is a little bit like matter or antimatter or Superman and Bizarro Superman, if you know what I'm talking about. And especially when those rights of exclusion are separated from use rights, right? People have veto rights and they don't have sort of ownership rights or some kind of use rights. And the idea of the anti-commons is interesting because it came from a fairly simple observation that a law professor had about retail activity in Moscow shortly after the fall of communism. And this professor was puzzled. He was walking down the street and he saw a large number of active kiosks, retail kiosks, on the sidewalks in front of empty storefronts. And the explanation was that in the transition from socialist property to private property, 4 groups of people were given rights to the storefront space. There was a local government council, there were users, there was something called balance sheet holders, there were regulators, and each had a right of veto over the use of that storefront space. And since a single party who opposed the use could keep the storefront then from being rented or sold, it was difficult for an entrepreneur, a startup retailer, to sort of overcome these transaction costs, these rights of veto. And so the tragedy of the storefront anti-commons was that the owners waste the resource when they fail to agree on its use. And there's this idea that one of the transaction costs in transfers comes from this anti-commons, that too many people have a right of veto over the transfer of water rights, whether it's the Bureau of Reclamation, state water engineer with a public interest standard, junior appropriators, concerned citizens, that at the end of the day, it makes it too difficult for transfers to happen. As a result, water markets don't work. So I just kind of want to highlight what one of those transaction costs might look like. Though I also thought about the anti-commons when it came to these collaborative governance mechanisms that you were talking about in regard like comprehensive river basin management and things like that, because the explanation for these collaborative governance processes is that everybody needs to come to the table, everybody gets a vote, and there has to be unanimity in order for the process to be legitimate. If everybody gets a vote and there has to be unanimity, then everybody gets a veto too. And so again, we have sort of an anti-commons working in that process, right? The inability for it to actually then be an effective governance process. And again, it seems like those we mentioned in the article, de facto rights, right? They don't have legal rights, they have de facto rights. Seem to be like holders of exclusion rights. And then I was wondering, and this is pretty outlandish, I think, but at least I was wondering, whether a regime from bankruptcy law might work in terms of governance. When someone files for bankruptcy, a debtor, the creditors are divided into different classes based on their priority. Some people, like the IRS, get a super priority, right? They get to jump to the front of the line, and they get, they get first dibs. If you remember my Chicago dibs analogy. Some post-petition creditors, people who lend money after the filing of bankruptcy, they get some super priorities. Various classes of secured creditors, right? People who have collateral, right? A mortgage on a house or a lien on a car, something like that. They get different priorities depending on their collateral and whether they're senior or junior creditors. And then you have this pool of unsecured creditors. And in bankruptcy, the rules are relatively clear, and the process is seen, I think, as legitimate by all involved. People are, understand where they are in the pecking order, and negotiate on that basis. And again, this seems like maybe a little bit of a stretch, and perhaps the differences in the history and the understanding of the bankruptcy code and these sort of collaborative water governance regimes is just too great. But I just wondered whether some kind of rule-based system like that might work here. So I think those are my comments.
Those are excellent comments, and let me just comment on the comments briefly. And then
there's a comment on the comment on the comment.
On Dr. Curry's points, I think they're important points, and I understand her concern about faith in markets, and I think there are people who advocate for markets who do it in an almost religious way. I think of, for example, a fellow who's a friend of mine, named Fred Smith, who's head of the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. And Fred's view is that things like tradable emission permits are not really a market solution because the market isn't setting supply, isn't determining how much is available. That's being determined legislatively by a cap or some other legislative measure. And so all the markets are doing is efficiently allocating the resource below that cap, but we don't know whether some number above that cap would actually be the better level of use. And so Fred says that's not a market thing. He's a purist about this. My view is if you can achieve that politically and then get more bang for your buck within whatever that political standard is, then that's a valuable use of a market mechanism. So I certainly acknowledge that. I guess I would say make two general points about Dr. Curry's comments. I think a lot of it goes to distributional concerns. And I would say the first thing, which I should have said probably in advocating for markets, is that markets is to be conscious of what markets promise or what advocates of market promise. They promise efficient allocation of scarce resources. That will reflect the existing distribution of wealth. And if you change the distribution of wealth, give some people more and some people less, you're going to get a different allocation because their tastes are different. You put somebody who loves to climb mountains into Bill Gates' shoes, including his bank account, and he's going to make different decisions than Bill Gates is going to make. So distribution matters, but not just because it influences the allocation of it. More importantly, it matters because we care about equal treatment of people. We care about the less well-off. And if there's anything in all of my years of teaching, which is many more than I care to remember, I've made these economic arguments, and I've had innumerable students who shut down their minds immediately on the grounds that, well, what about the distributional market? Well, my only answer is those are another question. They're not an unimportant question. They're a very important question, but they're another question. So if we want to deal with distributional issues, then we should deal with them straight on, but not throw out the market, the power of the marketplace to get us efficient resource allocation. And unfortunately, what usually happens in the political marketplace is that we create systems to redistribute wealth, and then we allow those who don't need the wealth to capture the system. Look at agricultural price supports. And I say this as the grandson of two Montana farmers who made their way entirely on government payments for wheat and corn. And maybe there was a time when my grandfather needed it, certainly not at the end of his career, he didn't need it. Certainly these large farm corporations don't need it. So once we go down the risk in the distributional path, which I think is an essential path, we need to establish distributional objectives and use government to do it, although there's a lot of redistribution that can and does happen privately. But we need to have it means tested and enforced, and it proves to be extremely difficult to do. Extremely difficult to do, to keep it bounded by those who need it. So I acknowledge those distributional concerns. I think they're very important. And they do happen on this scale question as well. It's not just nationally, if we're in a global market, which we seem to be in, the impacts locally all over the globe are going to be pluses and minuses. There's no doubt about it, and we need to be in a position to try to respond to them. I was intrigued with your observations about New Zealand. New Zealand's a fascinating place. I happened to have spent a year there back when New Zealand was basically a semi-socialist state. And not that long ago, not that old, it was 1979, 1980. And what really intrigued me about New Zealand at the time was it was said to be a contrast to the United States, because New Zealand cared mostly about equality and the United States cared about liberty. And so New Zealand was, you know, I could buy a bottle of milk for, I don't know what it was, 3 or 4 cents when I was in New Zealand, because the dairy industry was so heavily subsidized. But a car, a used, crappy car, cost me 3 times what it would have cost here. And it was all because of the regulatory system that New Zealand was in, and because New Zealand was then at the tail end of being the beneficiary of having an exclusive market in Great Britain, which they lost when Britain joined the common market. And so New Zealand had to find their way some other way economically. But the contrast is really striking. And interestingly, water law in New Zealand, I went there, I was a water law teacher, and I said I wanted to talk to the water law professor. And so I found this guy who said he was the water law professor, and it turned out we didn't teach any of this. His water law was really drainage law. That's what we call it. The problem is too much water. Unlike the American West, where the problem is not enough water, or at least water in the wrong places. I had one other thought, which I think was a very deep thought, and I can't read my notes. On the point, which also makes an important point, that the markets tend to lead us to think of humans as consumers and only as consumers. I would certainly acknowledge that it's good to think of humans as something other than consumers. But I also think that there's a lot of things that we don't ordinarily think of as consumer goods that, in fact, markets can be pretty good at allocating. Like habitat, wildlife habitat protection. Under certain kinds of circumstances, markets have been extremely successful at preserving wildlife habitat where government regulation has failed. So I think the markets are sort of as broad as our imagination and as broad as our ability to establish property rights that can function. And that is certainly a severe limit with respect to some kinds of human values. On the transaction costs question, I think the anti-common point is an important one, and I guess I would argue that a lot of what one might analyze as anti-commons are in fact the result of one kind of government regulation or another that creates these vetoes. So, for example, there's an organization in Washington, D.C. called the Institute for Justice, which is specialized in trying to allow people of limited means to get into markets where they can be entrepreneurs, like taxi cab drivers, or hair braiders, or other kinds of entrepreneurial activities, where there's all kinds of rules that effectively allow people already in those businesses to veto it. So, for example, in the city of Portland right now, there's a movement to try to expand the number of allowable taxi cabs. Well, why in the world is there a limit on the number of taxi cabs? There used to be something called certificates of convenience and necessity, where the state decided how many buses we need running between Portland and Seattle, and how many taxi cabs we need on the streets. And most cities have those kind of rules. And the effect of those rules is to preclude people who can't get a permit, and if there's a limited number of permits, there's a lot of people who can't get them from participating in the market, and thereby it makes the market ineffective. The bankruptcy point is a fascinating one. And again, I guess I would point out that, to me, the most important point I take from that is that what's important to functioning markets is certainty. We need to know what the rules are. We don't only need to know what property rights have, but we need to know what the regulatory rules are, because they, in effect, help to define the property rights. I can say I have a right to use my property in whatever way I want, except for whatever the government says I can't do. We could have a rule like that, and we wouldn't have property rights that were worth much, because we wouldn't have any idea what the government was going to say we couldn't do. On the other hand, we can have a rule that says I can do what I want, except I cannot grow a hedge that's higher than 6 feet if I live on a corner lot, and I cannot build closer than X feet to the street, and I can't build high. When I buy my property, if I know what those rules are and I know they're not going to change, then we got a market. It works. And so in the bankruptcy area, people do know what the rules, and a good illustration of what happens when they don't is what happened in the General Motors takeover by the Obama administration, where the rules were totally twisted around, and people who were lower in line, namely the unions, ended up at the top of the line and pushed higher. People who thought, and had good reason to think they were higher in line, were pushed to the lower. So I think that point makes very well, underscores the importance of predictability and certainty in the rules, which was really much of my objection to a lot of the public rights stuff that's happening in water law, where judges are sort of going off and saying, well, there was never a right the public held to prevent you from doing this historically, but things have changed and we're going to say there's a right now that never existed before. That makes water markets very, very difficult to function. So I'll stop there and I'll
Let's take, how about 10 more minutes, and we'll see if students have any questions to ask. This is your chance to speak now, or forever hold your peace. A little bit too much gloom and doom, perhaps, to try to draw out questions.
Going back to your trump card idea of individual rights, that the problem with it, or what I think like a problem I could propose was like it's so time consumed. Like people always play the trump card when they're about to lose something, or they're about to they just need it. So it's like completely just oriented around time. So like we're about to lose our environment, so then we speak up and use our individual rights to do something about it. Like right now, what about the future?
Well, you know, if rights are functioning as a trump, if that's a fair metaphor for what rights do, I think it goes to what I was just saying about certainty. If we know what those rights are, everybody knows what they are. The government knows what they are. Private parties know what they are. Your neighbor knows what they are. Then they just become part of what defines the scope of your property right, or whatever other kind of right you're asserting. So if we think about them in the right way, they're just functioning all the time, and the only time we ever actually have to play our trump card is when somebody else fails to acknowledge that we have that trump card. And in the property realm, it happens between private owners. You know, sometimes, one person puts their fence 2 feet onto the neighbor's property, and their solution is, if it becomes a battle, is to play their trump card of property. More often, it happens when government tries to regulate property or limit property in some way. And I would have thought that the Constitution, which says nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, that meant what it says. That it doesn't say the government can't take property. One can restate it and say government can take your property as long as it's for public use and as long as they pay for it. But if you look at the case law in that area, that trump card has proven to be a pretty weak trump card. You almost never win when you try to play your property rights trump card unless there's a total diminution of value in it, or the government actually physically occupies the property. So, I think it's a metaphor for what one way of looking at rights, which is to say that it is supposed to override any legislative power or any power of other private rights.
That's a good question. Mr. Huffman, I asked this question earlier today to Professor Curry and Gretchen. As I understand it, when you talk about the need for predictability and certainty of the rules under law, and we talked earlier today about the law creating sets of precedents that then become very important. But at the same time, resources can be a very organic thing. What was that black goop in your backyard in the year 1050 suddenly might be a very valuable oil pool now. So how is that balanced with the flexibility that's needed whether it's a market solution or a regime under the law, to move with perhaps technological differences in how we define resources or uses that we find? How flexible does the law have to be because the definition of what constitutes a resource is, as I understand it, set in cement, but it changes with human creativity and technology.
Right. I suppose a good illustration of that point is wetlands, which historically were a nuisance. They were, the objective of everyone was to get rid of them. and thereby, not entirely for the purpose of creating more arable land, but also because of disease and other things that were in fact associated with it, maybe sometimes mistakenly thought to be associated with it. And so we go from a time when we believe, and everyone generally agrees, that wetlands are bad, to a time when we've now decided that they're good, and we need not only to preserve the existing ones, but to recreate some that we've lost. And what should the law do along the way? Well, maybe I'm going to sound too much like a market purist here, but I guess my view is that wherever we started in time and established the property rights, from that point forward, the best way to adjust is to have those rights bought and sold. So somebody today who thinks that land that's a wetland is worth more as a wetland than as a drained wetland, they ought to be in a position, they ought to undertake to purchase it and preserve it. Or if the transaction cost of that and scale that's too big, the government ought to do it. And I've never done the math. It probably wouldn't be easy to do the math, but what would it have cost for every piece of wetland that has been regulated out of use by the government, for the government to have purchased it? It'd be a pretty big number, but probably a pretty small number in relation to the kinds of numbers we now talk about in government budgets. And I don't see anything immoral or inappropriate about that. That's the way markets work with respect to any kind of resource. Sometimes people value it for one use, and then it becomes valued either by those same people or other people for another use. And we're faced with those three choices that I suggested as ways to allocate them. We can do it through some kind of a government mechanism and pay for it, or through a government mechanism and not pay for it, or we can just allow the private market to function. So I think I guess I'm not very sympathetic with the argument that we were operating on a mistaken understanding about wetlands historically. Certainly we didn't know as much about wetlands historically as we do now, and they're valued logically. But that's the way it is with everything. We keep learning more, we keep getting more information. And that's one thing markets allow us to adapt, is as we get more information, we can adjust our uses, and we can do it instantaneously rather than through the slow and tedious processes of government, which are always available to be captured by somebody who happens to have more influence. It really goes back to a point Dr. Curry made about what about the people who can't afford to play in the game? And I think that's a legitimate point, although I think in the environmental game, we've seen that people who care about the environment can, in fact, afford to play in a lot of environmental market games if they can get their resources aggregated. The real obstacle is that aggregation problem of getting all the people who care about it and having some mechanism to get the resources there. But it certainly has happened.
Committee meetings are usually horrible.
Right. My rule about committees, when I was not the dean, but a faculty member being asked to be on committees, was I would be happy to be on the committee if I was the only member and I could be chair. Otherwise, I don't like committees.
Well, I was just wondering about the issue of responsibility. So, we talk about rights and thinking about wetlands. So where's the line between rights, but then also responsibilities for the whole? I always get worried about society becoming so oriented towards what is owed me rather than what I owe the community.
Yeah, I'm going to base on his name. A fellow who did a lot of writing back in the 70s and 80s, on the environmental subject, and he argued that people basically are sort of dual personalities. There's their individual personal welfare personality, and there's their community personality. And I suspect maybe there's something to that. I guess I think that there's a whole lot of ways that communities can function voluntarily and very effectively without the use of government, which is not an anti-government argument. It's that government then allows for rent seekers and others to come in and try to capture the system. So, you know, de Tocqueville was much in praise of private associations in 19th century America, and I think that was a good perception that so much happened historically. You know, my grandparents, one was the Farmers Bureau, one was the Farmers Union, but these were private enterprises that did a lot for agricultural users and didn't have to call in the government to make it happen. But at the same time, you know, you mentioned the national parks. I can remember I was totally outraged the first time I went to a national forest in Montana, and they wanted to charge me to camp there. I thought, this is outrageous. But I've come around to believe that we really should price our parks at their value and deal with the wealth distribution problem directly. Because think about it, you can buy a pass that allows you to go to every national park in America for a whole year for something like $50. A car full of you. And yet, what do you pay to go to a Mariners game? You can't buy a good seat for $50. So, why not charge a lot more for these incredible amenities we have, and then deal with the wealth problem directly by subsidizing those who can't afford it? And then we'll get a lot less people in Yellowstone National Park, which will be good for Yellowstone National Park, and we'll give them a budget to actually manage the place for purposes other than elk habitat. I've gone way off.
All right, well, let's thank the... Welcome to, we'll stick around for a little bit here, so feel free to come on up and ask questions of any of our speakers. Also remember that Emily is in the back giving away free goodies, so sign up for ISI staff as well. Otherwise, we'll see you all later.
Yeah.